Well, hi, everybody. Thank you for joining us on Unstoppable Mindset. Today we have Bradley Akubuiro with us. Bradley is a partner in Bully Pulpit International. He'll tell us about that, but he's been involved in a variety of things dealing with corporate communications and has had a lot of adventures. He deals with diversity, equity, and inclusion. But most of all, before we started this, he had one question for me, and that is, how much fun are we going to have on this podcast? Well, that really is up to Bradley. So Bradley, has some fun.
Michael, thank you so much for having. This is going to be a ton of fun. I'm really excited. Thanks for having me on.
Well, you're absolutely welcome, and we're glad that you're here. Had a chance to learn about you, and we've had a chance to chat some. So why don't we start, as often and Lewis Carroll would say, at the beginning, and maybe tell me about you growing up and those kinds of things.
Yeah, I'd be happy to do that. And, I think I would be remiss if I didn't start off talking about my parents a little bit before I talked about myself. My dad grew up in the Biafran War in Nigeria, Civil War in Nigeria. And, while he was going through school, they were bombing schools and it wasn't safe for adults to be out. And so, he was the guy in his family at 6 years old who was taking crops from their plantation. They grew up maybe about 6 hours outside of Lagos, Nigeria, and was moving, some of these crops 2 miles away to sell in the marketplace. And, at a very early age was learning responsibility, not just for himself, but for the family.
Wow. Which is something that more people should do. So what all did he do, or how did all that work out?
Yeah, well, this was a really interesting time in Nigeria's history where you had a lot of folks who were in this circumstance. And my dad was a really hard worker. His parents were hard workers before him. His father was a pastor. And so he had a certain level of discipline and support in his household. But, he knew that he had this kind of onus on him. So grew up at a time then where not only did he have this responsibility, but a big family, brothers and sisters to take care of. He was the guy who was chosen later, flash forward a few years, to come to the United States, to be able to find an opportunity here in this country, and to be able to always hopefully give back to his family there.
So he came, and how old was he when he came here?
When he got to the States, he was about 17. So came to New York City, not a lot going on there. No. And, he had to put himself through school.
Did he know anyone, or was anyone sponsoring him, or how did all that work?
He had a little bit of family here, but he had to find his own way, get a full-time job at a gas station, and work to figure out what this country was all about, but also how to be successful here.
Where did he stay when he got here then?
Got a little apartment up on the kind of Washington Heights, Harlem area of New York. Little hole in the wall, and continue to work to pay that off while he was trying to pay off school. So not easy, but at the same time, a really, really great opportunity for him to kind of start fresh and create some opportunity for himself and family.
So did he come at least with a little bit of money, or how did all that work?
It's funny you asked that question. He did come with some, but it wasn't a lot. Let's start off there. But what's interesting about that is, he had put himself through undergrad, put himself through a master's program, and was doing a PhD program over at University of Pennsylvania in Philadelphia. And at Penn, he blew through his entire life savings in one semester. And so, was on a great path. He was studying engineering, and, a semester in, he's like, uh-oh, what am I going to do? Ended up going across the street to Drexel, where they were able to bring him in and give him a scholarship as long as he was willing to TA, which he really enjoyed doing. And he was able to put himself through the PhD.
Wow. So he started there as a freshman then?
So he went to several different schools, started in New York. Yep. Sorry. He started in New York at Hunter College, did a master's program at Clark Atlanta University in Atlanta, and then came up to do his PhD at Penn.
And then went to Drexel.
And went to Drexel.
he moved around. How come? What took him to Atlanta, for example? Do you know?
Yeah, well, it was the opportunity. One of the things that he had learned and had been instilled in him growing up, which he's passed on to me, is you follow the opportunity where it's at. And as long as you're not afraid to take that risk and take a chance on yourself and your future, that will ultimately, more often than not, pay off in the end. And so he followed scholarship dollars. He followed the programs that would have an opportunity for him. And he went exactly where it took.
And what were his degrees in?
So his master's degree was in chemistry. His PhD was chemical engineering.
Wow.
Yeah.
What did he do with that?
So, well, the world was his oyster, I suppose, in some ways. But, he ended up, going into a couple of different companies, started with Calgon Carbon in Pittsburgh, and spent a number of years there and later on to Lucent Technologies and fiber optics. And so, he's moved on to a number of different companies, engineering roles, eventually got his MBA and has been, employed in a number of different places and continued over his career to work in a number of different geographies as well, whether that's going to Pittsburgh, New Jersey, Atlanta, Massachusetts. They're now living in Rochester, New York, which I've never lived in, but it's a very charming place. It is. Yeah.
It is a nice place. Been there many times.
Yeah.
And for customers and so on, it's a fun place to go. Well, he obviously learned in a lot of ways, some might say the hard way, but he learned to value what was going on with him because it was the only way he was going to be successful. So nothing was handed to him at all, was it?
That's right. He had a very strong family foundation, and he definitely learned a lot from his parents and from his family, and they were very close. So I think that he would say that's what was handed to him, but he certainly didn't get any leg up.
Right. Well, that's a good thing to have handed to you, I guess. Well, how did he meet somebody from Gary, Indiana, which is a whole different culture?
Well, this becomes a love story pretty quickly, doesn't it, Michael?
You can embellish all you want.
Well, my parents actually met somewhat serendipitously. They were at two different schools. My mom was going to school in Alabama A&M. My dad was going to school at the time in Clark Atlanta in Atlanta, so about 4 hours apart, Huntsville and Atlanta. My mom's roommate was dating my dad's roommate. Oh. And so when my mom agreed to come with her roommate to go and visit her boyfriend at the time, she happened to meet this strapping young Nigerian man in Atlanta, and they ended up hitting it off. And as fate would have it, the other two, their respective roommates, didn't make it the distance, but they had a budding romance that ended up lasting now at this point several decades.
Wow. So they're still with us?
They're both still with us, both going strong.
That is really cool. So what do you think you learned from them?
Oh, I learned a number of things. I learned, first of all, and you heard it in my father's story, resilience. He has learned to take whatever has been thrown at him, be able to not only take it in stride, which I think is good, but more importantly, to turn it around and channel it and to use it to his advantage, no matter what that might be. And he's instilled that in me and my two sisters. I got two sisters, one's older and one's younger. And that's really been important. When it comes to my two parents, the things that they value a ton are education, family, and when you think about the world around you, how are you leaving it in a better place than you found it? And if you can really focus on those handful of things, then you are going to have a very fulfilling and successful life. And that's how they measured success. I've taken that away from them.
It doesn't get better than that. And if you can say that I want to make a difference and that I hope I've made at least a little difference, it doesn't get better than that, does it?
That's exactly right.
So then you came along, and we won't put any value judgment on that.
Thank you for
Maybe
that.
we could have fun. Yeah, exactly. But actually, before I go to that, have they been back to visit Nigeria at all?
Yeah, absolutely.
Oh,
Unfortunately, the most recent time that my parents took a trip back was the passing of my grandmother a handful of years ago, and so that brought them back. But one of the things that I'm hoping to do, and I haven't done it yet, is just spend some real time out there. I've got plenty of family that's still there, so go in and spend a little time in Nigeria that's longer than a quick in and out trip. I've spent some time, and we've talked about this, before, Michael, but in West Africa generally, in Liberia, and that was a great experience. But there's nothing quite like going back to where it all began with your family.
No, it's still not home.
Right.
Well, so you came along, and so what was it like growing up in that household and going to high school and all that?
Well, there's a couple ways to answer that.
Go ahead.
Well, let's put it this way. We have a very close family bond. And so, when you think about the folks who finish your sentences, who laugh at your jokes because they think it's funny, and if you hadn't told that joke first, they probably would have told that joke. That's the kind of family we have.
Which is great.
It's a great, great dynamic. And so I was very fortunate to have grown up in that household with parents who truly, truly embraced that side. It was also a tough household. My parents were very strict. My father, especially, coming from this immigrant mindset and this Nigerian culture. I mentioned he valued education. What I didn't mention quite, but might have been a little bit implied, and I'll say it more explicitly, is anything less than an A was entirely unacceptable. And so there were a number of times where I found myself on the wrong side of that one. And, we grew up in different times as my parents were trying to provide the best life they could for us in a number of different urban settings. And one period of life for me was particularly salient in high school, where the school district of Springfield, Massachusetts at the time graduated about 54% of the students that went through that system. And so you're thinking about 1 and 2 kids who don't make it out of high school, much less make it to college, much less have a successful and fulfilling career in life. And my father especially, but of course both my parents, wanted to do absolutely everything in their power to ensure that those would not be our statistics, that we would be able, my sisters and I would be able to have every tool at our disposal to be successful. And they worked hard at that despite the circumstances.
So how were they when, I'm sure it happened, it was discovered that maybe you had some gifts, but there were some things that you weren't necessarily as strong at as other things? How did that work out for you?
I want to be very clear. The list of things that I wasn't quite as good at, especially in those days, was long enough to stun you. So, we worked through it together, right? And I think one of the things that I admire most about my parents now that I maybe didn't appreciate enough growing up was just the amount that they leaned in and were willing to be hands-on and helping with our education. And so my father would give us times tables when we were in elementary school and make sure that we worked through them. And if we didn't get them quite right, we would do them again, and we'd do them again, and we'd do them again. And I remember a time when I was in the 5th grade where my father had me up until 1 a.m. doing math problems. And, I was thinking to myself, I cannot imagine doing this with my kids when I was at that age, and I swore at that time that I never would. I'll tell you what, Michael, now I swear that I definitely will. Maybe not till 1 a.m. I think there's probably a better time, a more reasonable time. But to be able to invest that level of effort into making sure that your kid has everything they need to be successful, I admire the heck out of it.
I remember a couple of times, I think one when I was 7 or 8, when we were living in California and going back to visit relatives in Chicago or driving somewhere. And my dad said, to me and my brother, who was 2 years older, you guys have to learn the times tables. And we spent time driving, just going through the times tables. And it took me a little while. And a couple of times I tried a shortcut that messed me up, but eventually I got it all figured out. And he said, when you say the times tables correctly, we'll give you 50 cents. And they did. When I got the times tables right, they did. And also I was learning algebra from him. My dad was an electronics engineer. And so he really worked, because I didn't have books in Braille early on until I was in the 4th grade. I had to study with them to a large degree. So he taught me a lot more than the schools were teaching little kids, as it were. So I learned algebra early, and I learned to do it in my head, and still do. And in high school, it got me in trouble in my freshman year, because my math teacher said, now, whenever you're doing things, you have to show your work. Well, I kept trying to tell her that for me, showing my work in Braille isn't going to do you any good. I can tell you what I do and how I do it. And she wouldn't accept that. And she was going to fail me, literally fail me in math, until one day I wrote out, I think, one of the problems. And I think just in case she took it and went somewhere where she could find somebody to read Braille, I wrote it out correctly. But I got a C in Algebra 1 because of that one thing. By the way, after that, I never got below an A in math. But she was insistent that you had to show your work, and wasn't flexible enough to recognize that there are a lot of ways to show your work.
Oh, yeah. Well, that's part of the challenge, and not to make this an entire commentary on our education system, but there are so many different ways, to your point, to get to the right answer. And I don't think there's nearly enough flexibility in our system in many cases, except for those who really, truly tried to find it and create that environment for their students. But at a broader look, there isn't nearly enough flexibility to appreciate that we are going to have many different ways to get to these answers.
I think that really good teachers, and there are a lot of good teachers, but I think the really good teachers make that leap and allow for flexibility in what they do, because they recognize everyone learns differently. But the big issue is, can you learn, and can you demonstrate that you learned?
Yeah, well, that's what we're all striving for.
It is. I was pretty blessed going through school, especially in high school. A lot of the times, I would stay after school an extra period to study in the library, because, again, not everything was available. So we actually had people who would read material to me or give me information that was written on boards that I didn't get any other way. And usually the teachers would come in, we would set up days, and they would come in and give me tests. And what was fun about that was we would go through the tests fairly quickly and spend most of the hour chatting. And I got to know a number of my teachers that way. And that was so valuable for me. One of them, especially Dick Herbolsheimer, I still know. And, he's going to be, 85, I think it is, this year. And he will be 85, I think, August 28th. We still keep in touch. He came to our wedding. And he tells me that I'm getting to be closer in age to him, and I point out that I'll never be as old as he is. and he tries to convince me that mathematically I'm getting closer, and I say 13 years is still 13 years.
Yeah, don't let him try to get you on that one.
That's right. It's not going to work.
It's so good. Well, I was going to ask you if you had a favorite teacher, because I feel like teachers, particularly in those formative years, have such an incredible impact on you and how you see yourself.
I remember a lot of things from a number of my teachers, and I can tell you the names of most all of my teachers. I remember in my freshman year English, our teacher was a Mr. Wilson. It was actually Woodrow Wilson was his name. And he was an older gentleman. True. And one day we were sitting in class, and he was just talking about philosophy, and he's talking about people's ethics. And he said, and I remember it, that, a good example is, if you need to borrow a quarter from somebody, be sure you pay that quarter back. Where does that come in English? But nevertheless, those are the kinds of things that he said, and other teachers said various things, and they stick with you.
Yeah, no, it's so true. I mean, for me, my favorite teacher was Darlene Caffey. She was my 4th grade teacher. Taught all kinds of, taught you everything you learned in fourth grade. But the most important thing for me was she gave me confidence in my writing ability. I had always enjoyed writing, but I never really thought of myself as someone who could potentially be a writer. And she was the first person who sat me down and said, "Hey, look, you submitted this assignment and it's really good. You could be a writer one day." And, she had me write poems. She had me write a number of different things that they weren't class assignments, but there were things that she was like, "Hey, if you want to do this, then you got to practice it." And I learned so much from her. But the most important thing I took away was that confidence in my ability to do these things.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's one of the most important things that good teachers can bring to us, and not tear you down because you don't necessarily do something exactly the way they do or want. But if you can demonstrate you learn, that is so cool.
Yeah, it is. Yeah, it is.
So, as I said, I keep in touch with Dick Herbolsheimer. On his 80th birthday, I flew to Nebraska, where they live, and surprised him for his birthday, which was a lot of fun.
Nice. That's awesome.
Yeah, it was a lot of fun. And hopefully we'll get back there one of these days soon. Meanwhile, I'll just give him a hard time on the phone.
That's good. Well, if Darlene and Kathy's out here listening, then I'm not going to surprise you. Don't listen to Michael, but if I show up, then I'll have a cake or something in hand.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Well, so what was high school like for you? I think you said there were some things that happened in high school.
Yeah, high school was when you think about formative, man, this was a formative experience for me. So it was between my sophomore and junior year of high school when one of my very best friends, a guy who I considered to be like an older brother to me, was shot and killed in a drive-by shooting. It was devastating. I had a period over a few months where not only was he killed, and I found out about it 45 minutes after I'd left town to take my older sister with my family to college, 22 hours away. So this wasn't something he did every night, and I'd likely have been with him had we not been on that trip. But he unfortunately passed that night with a 45 caliber bullet hole in his heart. My experience with school, with life, it really took a turn at that point, because not only had I lost somebody who was very close to me, but the police didn't catch the guy who did it. In fact, they caught a guy who was a friend of ours that had absolutely nothing to do with it, and put him through absolute hell, only to find out that he wasn't responsible for this. And any of us could have told you that right up front.
Wow.
That was a terrible time. A couple of months later, Michael, we had another one of our close friends who was shot and killed. And the girl who was with him at the time was shot in the leg trying to get away. And another month and a half after that, another one of our good friends was, shot in his own driveway trying to get into his car and head to the grocery store. And it wasn't safe for us. And it was a really, really challenging time just to exist, much less to try to focus on school and to focus on other things that are going on. How could you do that when you didn't know if when you left in the morning, you were going to be able to make it home at night?
Why was there so much crime?
Well, that's $1 million question.
Yeah.
There are so many factors that go into it. And since then, I've spent a lot of time thinking more about the kind of, macro factors. But the very specific on the ground situation at that time was there was a gang war between two rival gangs, street gangs in the city. And Junior, who I just referred to, lived right in the heart of Eastern Avenue, which is the home of the Ave in Springfield, the gang there. And across State Street was Sycamore, and a number of different folks and rivalries had kind of established then. And so, this was not that there's ever, really sensical reasons that, these things happen, but this was as nonsensical as it could be. People who were killing each other and dying for reasons that if you were to ask those who survived now why they would ever pull a trigger in a situation like this, they probably couldn't really tell you or maybe even remember.
So it wasn't race or anything like that. It was just the whole gang environment mostly.
Yeah, that's right. And at the time, you think about the economic factors that go into this. And I talk about this in the context of Chicago all the time because that's where I live now. And the situation is just as salient here. But if you were to be on the west side of Chicago, the westernmost neighborhood within the city limits of Austin, you would be in one of the poorest and one of the most dangerous zip codes in the industrialized world. If you were to go 2 miles over to Oak Park, one of the suburbs just outside of the city, it's one of the wealthiest in the region, and it is an amazing neighborhood. And the infrastructure across the board, where it comes to the education system and the amount of money per pupil, if you were to look at the crime statistics, if you were to look at the policing, if you were to look at any measure of quality of life, it is night and day different, but it's separated by a couple of streets. And that to me is unfathomable.
It is crazy. Of course, you also have some really serious gangs back in Chicago, the notorious ones, the Cubs and the Sox, for example.
That's right. And you know what? The competition, fierce. You don't get in the middle of those two sets of fans.
No way. And ne'er the twain shall meet, period.
That's right. That's exactly.
There aren't very many people who will say they're fans of both.
I don't think that's legal, actually.
That would explain it. So I'll tell you, sports fans are really tough. I remember when I lived in Winthrop, Mass, right outside of Boston, and every year on opening day, I'd be somewhere in Boston. And if the Red Sox lost, immediately, basically everybody on the news and everyone else just said, wait till next year.
Yeah.
They were done. It was it. No faith at all.
That's right.
It was amazing. And I remember living back there when Steve Grogan was booed out of the Patriots game one year. And I'll tell you, they're amazing.
Well, look at the dynasties they've got now. Unbelievable. What a turnaround. Although, I live with a diehard Tom Brady fan. My fiance has been a Patriots fan since the beginning, and it's been a complete nightmare trying to figure out: are we watching the Patriots? Are we watching the Buccaneers? And are we Tom Brady fans? Are we Patriots fans? It's a little bit of everything in that house. But I can't ever say that I'm not happy. I am a fully dedicated supporter of all things Tom Brady and the Patriots now. Otherwise, I'm in a lot of trouble.
It is safer that way. Well, I have gained a lot of respect for Tom Brady, especially after he left the Patriots, not because I dislike the Patriots, but just because of all the scandals and the deflated footballs and all that sort of stuff. But he came back and he proved, hey, it's not what you think at all. I really am good. And he continues to be good.
Yeah, it's 100% right. Well, and not to make this, even a broader topic about Tom Brady, he gets plenty of press, but the fact that he was able to say, all right, you have decided that I'm done in this sport. You've decided I'm too old to play this sport, but I have not run to the end of my capability. And in fact, I've got a lot more to offer this game. And he went and he took it with someone who would respect that in the Buccaneers, and he won another championship. I mean, you can't make this up.
No, absolutely you can't. And so we'll see what the Rams do this year. I like the Rams. I grew up with the Rams. Of course, I'm really prejudiced when it comes to sports and probably a number of things because we've been blessed out here in California with great sports announcers. I mean, of course, Vin Scully, the best of all time in baseball. And I will argue that with anyone. But then Dick Enberg did a lot of football, and he did the Rams and he did the Angels. And of course, we had Chick Hearn, who did the Lakers. Their descriptions and the way they did it, especially Vinny, just drew you in. Yeah. And I've listened to announcers all over the country and never got the kinds of pictures and announcing and announcements that I got by listening to people in California. So I'm a little prejudiced that way.
Well, and you should be. You absolutely should be. And I'll say this, the power of storytelling that these folks that you just described are able to wield is phenomenal. And it's a skill that I actually wish more folks had in more different industries, because if you can tell a strong, compelling story, you can make it visual, you can bring people in like that. The power it has to bring people together and to motivate them to act is just unbelievable.
Johnny Most was a good announcer, a pretty great announcer in basketball, but not really so much into the storytelling. But he had a personality that drew you in as well.
Well, that counts for a lot.
It does. I remember living back there when the Celtics were playing the Rockets for the championship, and the Celtics lost the first two games, and Johnny Most was having a field day picking on the Rockets and so on, but Moses Malone was criticizing the Celtics and said, I could go get 4 high school people and we could beat these guys. Wrong thing to say, because then the Celtics came back and won the next 4. And Johnny Most really had a field day with that.
That's what happens.
Yeah, you don't open your mouth.
Right.
So you went to Northwestern. That's a whole different environment.
Totally different environment. And, I got to tell you, I owe a ton to Northwestern. The exposure it gave me to more global mindsets. People come to that university from all over the world, all kinds of different socioeconomic backgrounds, and looking to do so many different things. The academic rigor of the institution and the resources that were at our disposal were so incredible that it completely changed my experience and, frankly, the outlook I had for my own self and career.
How so?
Well, I'll put it this way. I went to school, for example, at the same time as students who had some similar backgrounds to the one I did, to being in school at the same time as, Howard Buffett, who's the, grandson of Warren Buffett, and Bill Pulte, who's grandson of the Pulte, the namesake of Pulte Homes, and, literally billionaire families. And so you start to realize, if you can sit in a classroom with folks like this and with all of the opportunities that they've had, the education they've had, private schools, things along those lines, and these are good friends, by the way, when you can do that and then realize, hey, you know what, I can keep up, I can do this. And then, you are receiving, grades, professors who support you, opportunities in terms of internships, all of these things in realms that you never even considered possible, even just a year or two earlier. It truly broadens your horizons in ways that I don't even think I could have appreciated before I was into it.
Wow. And that makes a lot of sense, though. We're all people, and we all have our own gifts. And the fact that you could compete's probably not necessarily the best word, because it implies that there are things that we don't need to have, but you are all able to work together and that you can all succeed. That's as good as it gets.
That's exactly right. And I do find, compared to a lot of places, Northwestern have a very collaborative culture. I found that, from faculty to staff to students, everybody was very interested in seeing everybody succeed. And, we believed truthfully that all of us could. There's enough room on the boat for all of us.
What was your major?
Journalism.
No surprise, being Northwestern.
Yeah, I was a big proponent of the journalism school, and actually still remain affiliated. I'm on the faculty over there and sit on the board of the journalism school, and have loved every second of my time wearing a purple t-shirt.
There you go. Is my recollection correct? Wasn't Charlton Heston a graduate of Northwestern?
I don't know the answer to that, but I wouldn't be surprised. You've got some really...
It seems to me I heard that he was doing something where he was doing something for Northwestern, as I recall, but that just strikes my memory.
Yeah, there's some very remarkable graduates from that organization.
So you were involved, as I recall, in our conversations about such things, in dealing with minority enrollment and so on. And you met some pretty interesting people during your time there. Tell me about that, if you would.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So my freshman year, actually, this was my sophomore year. We actually only brought in 81 Black freshmen, and that was the lowest number in terms of Black enrollment in a given year at Northwestern since the 1960s. And so, the university was looking around and trying to figure out, well, what is it that we're doing, and where are we missing the mark, and how do we not only attract Black applicants, because we were able to get folks to apply. The challenge was to actually get them to choose to matriculate. And where were we losing folks in the process? And so, I had been really, really interested in participating in some of the work around minority recruitment and enrollment from the time that Northwestern had recruited me, because I recognized my background wasn't necessarily what you would consider to be orthodox for the folks that got into schools like this. But they took a real hard look at me and said, we think this guy can be successful here. And I wanted to encourage others who might not necessarily think of Northwestern as an option that was attainable to them, or not even know about it, to really start to understand the opportunities that could be available to them. And so I was, flying to different schools, not only in the Chicago area, but back in places that looked a lot like where I grew up, and telling, folks, Northwestern wants you, and you should really give it a shot. And so that was a fascinating time for me in my own development in that space.
So what did you do for the school and dealing with the whole issue of minorities in that time?
Yeah, there were a handful of things. There's one was, how do you create programs that channel some of the frustration that a lot of students who looked like me had? And so a number of folks actually, and this is the spirit of college students, gotten together, put up signs and decided to kind of protest. And so instead of going through and just kind of registering our anger, what I did was work with the admissions office, and I did actually formally work as a work study student and worked on some of this stuff. It wasn't just volunteer, but take this energy that the students had and create programs like a pen pal program, like a fly-in program, some volunteer initiatives that we could have that would allow students who are upset about the outcomes to help change those outcomes by direct engagement with those who might come to Northwestern, and really improve our metrics for the following year. And we were able to do that both in the African-American and Latino communities.
What did you discover, or what did the university discover about why people might apply but then didn't matriculate? And then how did you turn that around?
Yeah, there were a couple of things. So one was, for students who were getting into places like Northwestern, very commonly we saw that they were getting into places like University of Pennsylvania, Stanford, Harvard, and a number of other universities at the same time. Particularly if you were to think about the minority students who were applying and getting in. And what those schools had that Northwestern didn't quite have was full need-blind admissions processes, which Northwestern did adopt. But the short version of this is, if you got into one of those schools, you were probably going to be able to get, if your circumstances required it, a full ride. And so, the economic opportunity was really significant. And you were at a disadvantage if you were a student who was interested in going to Northwestern or any of these other schools that was really good, but you couldn't afford to go, and you're going to go to the place that you could afford to go. And maybe that's your local school, or maybe that's one of these other schools. But we had to really do something to create the funding to ensure that these folks could go to the school and do it at a rate that wasn't going to break the bank.
And you found ways to do that?
Well, I certainly didn't do it alone, but the university,
the university found ways to do that.
Yes, that's right. We started up a commission. So a number of students, myself included, formed a petition. At the time, Morty Shapiro, who was the president of the university, took this issue very seriously as a economic scholar, and genuinely his background is in the economics of higher education. and he started at the school as president while I was in, again, my sophomore year, as a lot of these things were kind of taking shape and taking hold. And as one of the most successful leaders that I've met, invited us in, students, the leaders in the university who were focused on this. And we had asked for a task force to focus on this, and he set one up and he chaired it. And it was focused on how do we create opportunities for access, particularly for this community that had need but wanted to be here. And, one of the things that he did pretty early on in his tenure was to establish a fund that was going to be dedicated to programs, to financial need, to a number of different things that would directly address this community. And we built on it from there.
Wow. That's, it's great that you had a strong champion who was willing to be farsighted enough to help with that, isn't it?
Absolutely. It would not have been possible without that.
So you met, as I recall you saying, Jesse Jackson somewhere along the way in that arena, especially since you were in the Chicago area. That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah. And I'm starting to put together, thanks to you here, that this was a pretty big year for me.
See? Getting impressed?
Yeah. So
you
I
didn't
did
know that about yourself, huh?
It's funny. But yeah, there was a convergence of things. And so in this particular year, I did meet Reverend Jesse Jackson, and this started a relationship that's been incredible and life-changing, that remains to this day. But the way that it happened, Michael, is that there was a woman, Roxana Saberi, who had been taken political prisoner by Iran, and she worked for the BBC. She had been a former Northwestern Medill student. So a number of us who were part of the journalism program at Medill had decided that we were going to get together, and as college students are wont to do, we decided to protest and hoped that we would, on our campus in Evanston, get the State Department to pay more attention to this particular issue, and hopefully take negotiating for her release seriously. And while I have no idea whether at the time Secretary Clinton saw anything we were doing, and my guess is probably not, Reverend Jackson, who to your point was just on the other side of Chicago, did. And the connection there is Roxana Saberi did her first interview with the BBC as a professional reporter with Reverend Jesse Jackson, and he was committed to advocating for her release. And so he actually reached out to us via the university, asked a few of us to come down and join a press conference with him, where he intended to go and negotiate for her release on humanitarian grounds. And I participated in that with another student, and it was absolutely phenomenal and led to so many doors being opened for me.
Wow. What year were you in school at the time?
So this was my sophomore year. Great. Again, still part of the great sophomore year. And I continued to work with Reverend Jackson throughout the remainder of my time in college and for some period after college. But there were a number of things, but it all tied back together because the issue that Reverend Jackson was advocating for at the time that spoke most deeply to me was this issue of college affordability and access. And he had this program called Reduce the Rate, which was all about reducing the interest rate on student education loans, because we had bailed out banks and the autos and so many others at rates of 0 to 1% and said, hey, you're in trouble. Pay us back when you're ready. We'll make it cheap and affordable for you to do that. But we never granted that level of grace to students who were supposed to be our future. And instead, we were breaking their backs with, interest rates of 6 to, in some cases, as high as 18% without any, kind of recourse. You get stuck with these things for life.
And people wonder why we keep talking about eliminating the loans today or lowering the interest rate. And the reality is, as you said, students are our future, and we should be doing all we can to support that.
That's absolutely right. I still firmly believe that. And, our loan system and frankly, the cost of education is just crippling.
It's crazy.
For It's crazy, and this is for multiple generations. I'm sad for what the future will look like if we can't figure this situation out.
Yeah. We've got to do something different than we're doing. And it's just kind of crazy the way it is. It's extremely unfortunate. Well, so you got a bachelor's. Did you go get any advanced degree or?
Well, I did actually attend Northwestern for a good portion of my master's, the integrated marketing communications program over there. And that dovetails really well into where my career ultimately went and where it currently resides. But, Northwestern was the educator of choice for me.
So career-wise, so what did you then go off and do since you opened the door?
Yeah, so it's been a number of different things, and this will sound a little disparate, but it all comes together. I went, after working with Reverend Jackson, to Liberia, and I spent time in Liberia working for the president of Liberia on post-war kind of reestablishment of a democracy, which was a big thing and frankly way above my pay grade. But I got an opportunity to work on it because I had spent time working with Reverend Jesse Jackson, and that will come back in a second. But there was a student who was doing his PhD program over at Northwestern who is, I should say, the grandson of a former president of Liberia who had been killed in a coup, William Tolbert. I had been friends with him. I knew that I wanted to get to West Africa to do some work, particularly around education and social programs. And he had connected me with his mother, who had been deputy minister of education. I had been fortunate enough to create an arrangement that I was really excited about to go to Monrovia in Liberia, the capital city, and to spend some time working on programs out there. And when she found out that I worked with Reverend Jesse Jackson, she called the president and said this could be a great opportunity. And they cooked up a program where I would actually champion and work on establishing a program and policy around leadership development and capacity building for the country post-Civil War, which was, again, an absolutely amazing and life-changing experience, but really hard.
What was the world like over there, and what was it like for you being from a completely different culture, as it were, than over in Liberia?
Well, the first thing I'll say is, if you live in the United States and you believe you know poverty, you ain't seen nothing yet. Because, one of the things that you will find in countries like Liberia and some of the places in post-war Eastern Europe in the 90s and different kind of places is there is a level of resilience and a level of spirit that is built into society that comes almost entirely from experience with incredible hardship, just absolutely incredible hardship. And Liberia at the time that I was over there was amongst the 5 poorest countries in the world after what had been 14 years of concrete civil war and 30 years of civil unrest. But the people that I met could not have been better spirited and just nicer, more optimistic and incredible people.
So how long were you over there?
I was over there for less than a year and spent some time doing consulting, even after I came back to DC, but was on the ground for less than a year.
And when you came back from Liberia, what did you go off and do?
When I came back from Liberia, and I want to, couch this in my rationale, I had worked for Reverend Jesse Jackson on these big kind of global programs that met presidents and heads of state, and business leaders and all these different folks. I went over to Liberia and got this chance to work on, kind of reinstituting a democracy in meaningful ways with the president, who later on became a Nobel Peace Prize laureate. And, what I came to realize, Michael, was that my opportunities were quickly outpacing my experience. And so what I said is, let's now try to find a place where I can get some of the fundamentals, some of the framework for a lot of the work that I had the opportunity to do. And the place that I chose to go was Booz Allen Hamilton, this management consulting firm, and
Yes.
one of the largest public sector practices in the world. And so I went in with the intention of really being able to shore up my skills.
And what happened?
Well, hopefully they'll tell you that I was successful.
Okay, good.
It was a really fascinating time to be there. You know, Booz Allen had a lot of significant contracts. This was the time of the Affordable Care Act's passage. And so, you know, at the time that I went over, I got to work almost exclusively on ACA, and a lot is talked about in terms of the legislative kind of process to get that accomplished. But what is talked a lot less about is the actual operationalization of it, and what that looks like to stand up state health exchanges in different states to actually entice somebody coming from, you know, a psychiatry program at a top medical school to choose to put on a uniform and go to a base at, you know, an Air Force base or an Army base, and provide clinical care for those who are returning from war in Iraq and Afghanistan. And all of these were provisions of the bill, but actually implementing those things was a very tall order. And so I got an opportunity to really kind of roll up my sleeves and work on a lot of that work. And that was incredibly formative work for me.
So it was a real challenge, of course, to get the Affordable Care Act passed. I remember in 2009, I was speaking at an event for a companies whose hospital boards and leaders of the staffs of the hospitals in the network were getting together. And I went to speak and talk about some of my experiences and talk about disabilities and so on. The person right before me was a medical expert. It was a person who talked about the whole concept of how we needed to change our whole idea and environment of medical care and what we really needed to do as a country and so on. And he had been involved in every president's investigation of how to change the medical system ever since, I think he went, this was 2009, I think he went back to Nixon.
Oh, wow.
And he said it all came down to the same thing. And he said the best example is he was doing this as part of the team for Bill Clinton. And they talked about what needed to be done, how to change the medical system, and everybody bought into it and so on, until it got down to specifics of saying what it was going to cost, and that they needed to deal with some of the provisions that eventually went into the Affordable Care Act. And he said, as soon as the politicians got a hold of it and said, this is a horrible thing, you're going to cause too much controversy, the presidents would all run. And that's why no one ever got anything accomplished. And he also said that Obama was probably going to get something passed. And he actually predicted almost to a T, if you will, what was going to pass. And that's exactly what passed and what didn't pass. And he said, later, we'll actually start to worry about the cost of medical coverage in this country, but they're not really willing to face that issue yet. And he predicted we would be able to do something by 2015. Well, that hasn't really happened yet either. And now we're maybe making a little bit of a dent, but it was very fascinating to listen to him predict, based on so many years of expertise, what was going to happen.
Yeah, I mean, that's incredible. And I will say, a lot of times the policy takes a backseat to the politics on these things. Yep. And it takes so much, will and kind of moral fortitude to get in there and drive these things, particularly when there's interest on the other side of it. But, I'm with you. We're not quite where I think he predicted we'd be in 2015, but driving towards it now, and hopefully we'll make more progress.
Yeah, we're slowly getting there. So what did you do after Booz Allen Hamilton?
Yeah, so the things that I really loved the most about that work during that time, the change and a lot of that kind of management strategy, was the change communications aspects of it. And so I knew that I wanted to get more fully into communications. And so the next few jobs for me were discreetly corporate communications, if you will. And so I got an opportunity to follow a mentor to a company called Pratt and Whitney, jet engine company. Builds jet engines from fighter jets to, the big commercial airplanes that we fly in, and loved that experience. Moved to kind of the corporate side of that company to United Technologies at the time, and worked on a number of different mergers and acquisitions, including the spinoffs of Otis, the big elevator company, to Carrier Air Conditioning, both of these which spun off into Fortune 200 publicly traded companies of their own, to ultimately what became, the merger with Raytheon.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. It most recently produced Raytheon Technologies. And so a really, really fascinating set of experiences for me there.
And then you along the way also, I guess, were part of the formation of Bully Pulpit International with the Obama-Biden administration.
I wasn't part of the founding. This all kind of happened in parallel with folks who I have a ton of respect for, who I now work with. Bully Pulpit Interactive was formed in 2009 with a number of folks who came out of that Obama campaign and then White House. And it started in the kind of digital marketing, digital persuasion space, and all of the kind of really amazing tactics and strategies that they learned on that campaign, particularly as social media was starting to become more popularized and more mass adopted. They said, how do we start to apply some of that stuff as you think about not only other campaigns, but to foundations and advocacy groups and to corporations? And, you flash forward 12, 13 years now, and this is a fully operational 250 person agency where we're focused on, how do you help organizations of all types, really express their values and find their voices on these really key, important issues. But also, how do leaders make really tough decisions on things like, Roe v. Wade and what that means for their employee base, and what they're going to do policy-wise and how they're going to communicate around that afterwards. On through gun reform, and what do folks do if you are operating in Buffalo or in Texas when some of the massacres that happened earlier this year happen. And this has been really fascinating. And I came over here after being chief spokesperson for Boeing, and it's been really fun to reunite with some old friends and folks who have been doing this kind of work for a really long time now.
So Boeing, so when did you leave Boeing?
Left Boeing just shy of a year and a half ago.
So you were around during the whole 737 MAX thing.
Well, interestingly, you bring this up. I was brought over to Boeing in response to the 737 MAX. I was asked to come over and to really think about what does a world-class media relations organization look like that is going to be transparent, accountable, and 24/7 around the globe. And more than anything, after you've had, two accidents on the scale that they had, how do we really become more human and how we interact with all of our stakeholders, internal and external, on a lot of this stuff. And that was a really, really, really challenging, but rewarding process to be part of and to help lead.
How do you advise people, or what do you advise people in those kinds of situations? You had a major crisis, and clearly there's an issue. What do you tell corporate executives to do, and how hard was it to get them to do it?
Yeah. So on the first part of that question, it really comes down to being human. You got to put yourself in the shoes of the people that you're trying to communicate with and to. If you are a person who lost a loved one on a plane that went down outside of, Addis Ababa and Ethiopia, if you were, one of the people who lost your spouse or your kid, the last thing you want to hear from a company is, we did things right from an engineering standpoint. What you want to hear from that company is, we are so sorry that this happened, and we are going to do absolutely everything in our power to ensure it can never happen again. And here are the steps we're taking, and here's what we're going to do to try to make things right. And you can never completely make things right in that circumstance, right, but you can at least be understanding.
I remember 1982 when we had the Tylenol cyanide incident. You know about that.
Yeah.
And of course, and what was the most impressive thing about that was within 2 days, the president of the company was out in front of it. And as you said, being human,
yeah,
that's a corporate lesson that more people really should learn.
Yeah, it's a difficult thing to do because I think, and this isn't just lawyers, but it's easy to blame it on lawyers. The natural reaction is to immediately think, well, what's my liability going to be? What are people going to think if they think that I actually did make this mistake? And how do I cover it up? And how do I try to diffuse responsibility? And that is exactly the opposite of what you should do. And this isn't just good communications. This is good leadership.
Good leadership. Yeah.
That's right. And we need more people to really understand that, to your point.
Well, and with Boeing, it sounds like, if I recall all the stuff that we saw in the news, which may or may not have been totally accurate, there were some issues, and it took a while to deal with some of that to get people to face what occurred, that necessarily things weren't going exactly the way they really should have in terms of what people were communicating or what people knew and didn't know.
Yeah. Well, and you asked the question, how difficult was it to get the senior executives to get on board with the new approach? And what I would say is, and this goes back to some of what we were talking about earlier, the top-down kind of approach to this, and what's happening in the most senior role matters the most. And the CEO who came in, this was after the former CEO was let go, the chief legal officer, the head of that business, and a number of different executives, you keep going on, had exited the company. The new CEO who came in, Dave Calhoun, who currently is still the CEO there, brought in this new wave, this refreshing new approach and culture, and was all about how do we ensure that we are being accountable and that we are being transparent, because that is what matters in this circumstance. And so with that license to operate, it was a lot easier to come in and convince folks, well, this is how we should approach this from a media perspective, from a communications staff perspective, and across the board with our customers, with regulators, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, because everybody was on board that this is what we needed to do. And frankly, it's the only way to not only repair our reputation, because this is a 100-year-old company that's been at the first of so many different things historically, from an aviation standpoint, and helped truly invent modern flights. So how do you create a reputation that people expect coming out of that, but also to respect, again, those who trusted the company? Because when you step on a flight, you know this, Michael, when you step on a flight, you don't want to think about whether it's going to make it to the other side or not. You want to trust that it's going to make it to the other side and focus on what you got to do when you get there and everything else in your life. And people had, for a brief period of time, lost that faith. And that is what we were really trying to restore.
Do you think you were pretty successful at getting faith and confidence restored?
I think we've made a good start at it. Yeah. Boeing still remains a client, and I would say that the work that is ongoing is going to take time, because it takes 5 seconds to lose your reputation. It takes a long time to rebuild it and to regain trust. And I think the company is committed to what it needs to do that, but it is a journey.
What do you advise people today? You do a lot of consulting, and you're involved in consulting with CEOs and corporations and so on. What's advice? What piece of advice would you give them, or do you give them?
I think one of the biggest pieces of advice, which has been especially a salient in a year like this, is really develop a clear understanding of who you are and who your company is, and develop some real fortitude around that. Because I think it's very easy for folks to say, the expectations of society have changed, and now it's hard to just run my business because I'm expected to speak on this and that, and I don't necessarily know how to engage in that way. And I say, well, find your North Star. Who are you as a company, and deliver on that? Because if you're trying to poll and get an understanding of what's going to land the best with every single incident, you're going to find yourself taking issues that are 50-50 and losing 100% of the time. You've got to really focus on what matters to you as a company and what is truly falling, again, that North Star. And you're going to find that more times than not, you'll be okay just trusting your gut on that.
You're not going to be able to be, or it's really difficult to be all things to all people without people seeing through it when you're not pulling that off.
That's exactly right. The one other thing I'll add, Michael, is that I think one of the biggest challenges that folks have that we've got to shake them out of is thinking that if you make one statement or launch one initiative and you move on, that you've done your piece. But I think one of the biggest opportunities for corporate America and for leaders that command the resources of major corporations in particular is to be able to create programs that will be sustainable and will really truly invest in moving the needle on important causes, because they have the leverage and the resources to do those things. But one announcement is a drop in the bucket and makes no difference. If you do something that's going to last longer than you as a CEO or as an executive, but is going to make a big difference in terms of the outcomes for a community, that's a legacy worth having.
And it's fair to talk about that. So the value of media relations, the things that you bring from journalism, training, and so on, all the way through the process, it's appropriate to do that, as long as, to use your words earlier, you're doing it in a human way and you're really showing the value. All too often, people just brag, and that doesn't add value. And I think people see through that.
People see through it instantly. And not only does it not help you, but to your point, it hurts you, not only in the immediate sense, but over time, it erodes trust. And that is something you can never get back operating in that way.
Trust, as you said, can be lost in 5 seconds, and it takes a long time to come back. I've seen that in so many ways. And one of my favorite examples isn't even a human way, but we adopted a dog in 2003 when I was at Guide Dogs for the Blind. It was a dog that had not made it as a guide dog. Actually, when she was 12 years old when we got her, but the note said that she was, what is the word? Not impetuous, strong-willed. So we think that she probably just had her own sense and wasn't really willing to focus. A wonderful golden retriever. She went back to live with her puppy raisers for 6 years, and then she went off and lived at some other place because they were moving to a place that couldn't keep her. And when she was 12, she was sent back to Guide Dogs for the Blind. The people that had her said she just really couldn't stay with them anymore. They didn't want to keep her. She came back really filthy and dirty, totally unresponsive to anyone. There was a big lump on her that they figured was an infected cyst. And we had dealt with some geriatric dogs, so we said we would take her, and then eventually we adopted her. But the lump was an infected cyst, but they said she's totally deaf. She doesn't respond to anything. The vet said we dropped a Webster's dictionary, you know how large those are, on the floor, and she didn't even flinch or respond. So we took her and we started working with her. And over time, we discovered she's not totally deaf. She was tuning everything out. And we can only think that she must have been seriously abused. She wouldn't deal with people. She wouldn't deal with us, and just was afraid of everything, and literally had created this shield around herself where she just tuned everything out. And we knew we finally made progress one day. She didn't like to go in our garage, so we think that she had just been left and locked in the garage of these people for a while. So she wouldn't go in our garage and get in our car and go for rides. And this is a golden retriever, right? Yeah. So she, one day we were going to an event at Guide Dogs for the Blind in Oregon. So we were going to be driving from Novato, California up to Gresham, Oregon, to Boring, Oregon. And I was taking luggage out to the car, and this dog, Panama was her name, literally shot around me outside into the garage and into our car. And we went, oh my gosh, somehow we've gained her trust that she was willing to do that. Now, she was pretty shivery going up in the car, but that was the breakthrough. And we found she wasn't really all that deaf. She had arthritis and other things. But I tell the story because trust can be regained, but you've got to be honest about it. You've got to be open about it. And you've got to be genuine, but you can regain trust.
That's absolutely right. I love that story. And, you know, it applies as much to people as it does to animals.
Absolutely.
And this is exactly, I mean, that is the crux of what reputation is all about. How do you approach a person with that level of respect, honesty, and show them that you care? Because if you don't show them, telling them 1,000 times isn't going to make a difference.
No, it's all in the actions.
Yeah.
Well, you've done a lot of writing, obviously, in your life. Have you written any books?
I've not written a book. I'm following your lead. I'm trying to learn how you got it done because I do a lot of writing, including for Inc. magazine. I have a regular column there, and I have just, you know, thought a lot about how do you tell some of these stories in such a compelling way in that format. And I'd love to hear how you've done it.
Well, I think it's all about stories. And coming from being in sales, I've learned that the best salespeople are really people who can relate and tell stories and teach. Sales is all about really teaching and advising. And again, building trust. My best sales guy that I ever hired, when I asked him, what are you going to be selling for us? Because I wanted to see how he would answer it. I always ask people that. And of course, they usually say, oh, we're going to sell your products and all that. He said, the only thing I really have to sell is myself and my word. And I will need you to back me up. And if I have any questions, I'll ask you, but that's the only thing I really have to sell. And he's absolutely right. The rest is stuff.
Yeah.
But stories are always important. And I think that stories are always wonderful to have. And the best people can tell you stories. They sense what you're looking to know, and they can inform and help you see what is relevant to do through stories better than anything else. And I've had situations where I've said, our product won't work, and here's why, but here's what will. And also, again, building trust, that always comes back in a rewarding way somewhere down the line. And it did when I and other people did it.
That's huge. Well, I 100% agree with that. And I do admire the work that you've done and the writing you've done. And maybe one day I'll actually do some of my own in terms of writing a book.
If you do, we want to know about it. And make it, make sure there's a good electronic copy that we can convert to Braille, or make an audio version of it, or both.
Yeah.
Because it's important to do that, since diversity needs to include disabilities again, or if you're going to talk about inclusion, we got to deal with disabilities. So that's important.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Well, I want to thank you for being on Unstoppable Mindset today, because clearly you've demonstrated the value of it and all the different things that you've done. And I have learned a lot. And I think we have had some fun, haven't we?
Oh, we've had a ton of fun. We got to do this. This is great. I appreciate you having me on. I learned a lot also, and this has been a fun conversation, but thank you.
Well, let's do it again. Absolutely. I would love to. And I'm sure there are more stories we can both tell and share. So let's do it. And
awesome.
I would hope that all of you who are listening, that you had fun too. So write us, let us know. You can email me at michaelhi@accessibe.com. I want to hear from you, please. Wherever you're listening to this, please give us a 5-star rating. And you're also welcome to go to my podcast page, www.michaelhingson.com/podcast. And Hingson is Hingson. And if you know anyone else who ought to be a guest, then we'd like to hear from you. And, Bradley as well. If you know anyone else that we ought to have on, I'd love to get your thoughts and meet other people, because this is all about showing us all that we're unstoppable if we choose to be.
That's absolutely right. Definitely, Michael.
Well, thank you all again. And thank you, Bradley, for being with us. And we hope that you'll be back, and that all of you will be back again next time for Unstoppable Mindset. And remember, we're doing 2 episodes a week now, so it can't get much better than that unless we go to 3. And we'll do that if we get more guests. So thanks again, Bradley, for being with us.
Thank you, Michael. Take care.